We'll give it another couple of minutes for people to join. Could I say to those I can see have joined the meeting, if we'd like to just use the chat for questions and not for comments or contributions. I'm going to give it one more minute and then we'll start. Okay, I think we should get the meeting underway. So welcome to everyone who has joined us. My name is John Puntis and I am co-chair of Keep Our NHS Public. The meeting is being recorded at present. So if people don't want to be recorded, just switch your videos off, please. And we would like to keep the chat open, but only so that people can put questions in there, not comments or introductions. Now, this meeting has been arranged by Keep Our NHS Public as part of our campaign against the Health and Care Bill, which we believe should be thrown out of Parliament. Around 240 organisations, most of them private companies, are accredited by NHS England to help develop the integrated care systems being set up by the bill through something called the Health System Support Framework. Several dozen of those, in fact, are US transnational corporations supplying the health insurance market. And this framework aims to transform the NHS into a digital and data-driven system where clinicians rely increasingly on algorithms, remote monitoring, big data, and artificial intelligence. Last year, many of you will recall, NHS England tried, without getting consent from patients, to collect comprehensive information from GP records and store this in a centralized database, ostensibly for academic research, but the scheme was paused when it emerged that the data was also available to private companies on payment of fees, and a lot of people then opted to have their information excluded from this data grab. However, doing that won't be an option if the Health and Care Bill is passed, as it seeks to put beyond any doubt NHS Digital's power to share data containing health or adult social care. It's been estimated that the information the NHS holds on its patients has a market value of several £billion per annum. And our political leaders seem to have their sights set firmly on making our personal data more widely accessible, both to government and to the private sector. So the aim of this meeting is to give an update of government intentions to make our health data accessible to the private sector and what this actually means. And I'm very pleased to welcome our two speakers. Martin Blanchard will provide an overview. He's from KONP's new data working group and is a career-long member of the Medical Practitioners Union, or Doctors in Unite as it's now more commonly known, and a long-time member of Keep Our NHS Public. Martin used to work in an academic psychiatry unit at University College London. I'm also delighted that we have Rosa Curling once again, a human rights solicitor and Foxglove director, who made a valuable contribution to the People's COVID inquiry on the collation of COVID-19 data. Foxglove's website declares, "We stand up to tech giants and governments for a future where technology is used to benefit everyone, not just the rich and powerful." And Rosa will focus on the potential harms of government proposals, as well as alternatives that support ideas of data solidarity and universal healthcare, a completely different kind of vision for how our data might be used. So I'm going to take Martin first, and then he'll be followed by Rosa, and then we will take questions from the floor. Martin, over to you.
Thank you, John. I'm just going to share my screen. There, okay, so you can all see that, right? And you can hear me, great.
Yep.
A very warm welcome to the first public webinar from the KONP Data Working Group. What is happening to our NHS data? During this meeting, I will present a brief overview of what has already happened to data in the NHS and some of our government's intentions. And then I will hand over to our guest speaker, Rosa Curling from Foxglove, who we are delighted to have with us to talk about harms related to data and the alternatives. In a situation where data is now the driving force of the world's modern economies, the free flow of data between the public and private sectors is a top priority for our government. The most highly sought after data is personal health data. Ernst & Young describes patient data as a valuable, intangible asset desired by multiple stakeholders, estimating the NHS's 55 million records as having an indicative market value of several £billion to commercial organisations. The NHS's diverse, detailed, cradle-to-grave and user-friendly data set will appeal to pharmaceutical, biotechnology, medical technology and insurance companies, and also to countries wishing to set up so-called sustainable health systems elsewhere in the world. Just a few points about integrated care system structure and how this seems to fit together. ICSs are NHS bodies required to work in partnership with local councils and others, including private companies, to coordinate services within a particular geographical footprint, manage performance, save money, and improve the health of their assigned population. The Health Bill allows an ICS's board to delegate some of its powers to provider collaboratives and place-based partnerships. These collaboratives and partnerships, including private companies, must design and manage an ICS's health and care services. Crucially, they must decide what, where, and how services will be provided. And whilst doing this, they must keep within the budget they receive, and at the same time help the system to keep within the budget it receives. To help them all do this, they will need to access our healthcare data along with derived analytics. ICSs shift the NHS from a universal comprehensive healthcare system to one that heavily relies on data to redesign its services and manage cost. Critical to that redesign is population health management. The idea of population in PHM typically refers to individuals who are covered by a health insurance plan or the patients of a healthcare delivery organisation. And like them, our ICSs will segment their populations according to needs, and from needs, they can calculate cost, and they will stratify individual patients' health risks. They will then try to intervene in those with high risk in an attempt to reduce the likelihood of any future need for more expensive care. That is, more expensive than the identified solutions. The majority of us will be considered to be at lower risk, and for most part, expected to self-care using advice from staff, websites, and apps, and to take the suggested preventive measures. We may be monitored and/or activated by staff who often only have a basic training, and increasingly they will rely on standardized measures and decision-making technologies such as computer algorithms. The ICSs also need to calculate how to allocate their restricted funding across the system. These are supposed to be value-driven systems, and value, according to NHS England, is a measure of the outcomes achieved per unit of resource used. However, it has become clearer that what has to be improved is allocative value. That is, obtaining value from the way you distribute the limited resource across the system. The mantra seems to be that value can only ever be measured in relation to the entire system, and best value is reached only when no further movement of resource around the system can increase value. The problem about where to spend money leads to complicated and controversial clinical decisions, some of which as campaigners we have already encountered under STPs. In my part of London, it was attempts to limit cataract surgery and joint replacements. They decided to concentrate on knees, but you could see that they wanted the bigger savings from hips. It was so clear to most of us that if you had the money, you could bypass the clinical reasons given for their referral management process. There's also an example from online educational material about moving resource from the treatment of acute on chronic infections in lung disease, seen as relatively low value, to attempts to increase the prevention of lung disease, relatively high value. These decisions will undoubtedly in the future be aided by the use of artificial intelligence algorithms. Such health resource allocation algorithms have already been used, certainly in the US during COVID, for critical who gets the ventilator type decisions, and they are being developed further all the time. With provider collaboratives and place-based partnerships doing all the design and provision of services, albeit within the parameters provided in the long-term plan, you could ask, why do you need an ICS? One answer is for the process and technology associated with aggregating, cleaning, curating, hosting, analyzing, and protecting the transformation of the raw data records into a consolidated longitudinal patient-level data set to provide the necessary big data and derived analytics at scale required to enable population health management and artificial intelligence development. Such linked together ICS databases with health, social care, voluntary care, and private sectors, and eventually the genomics required for personalized care, are apparently the most commercially valuable databases. Indeed, some say that the database generated from the NHS will be among the best in the world, an enormous commercial asset for those involved. Until now, personal health data has belonged to a special category requiring extra protections. Yet there is a risk that safeguards will be weakened in the interests of government, the private sector, and economic growth. This is clear from proposed legislation, such as the Police, Crime and Courts Bill, and current government strategies, including the Life Sciences Industrial Strategy Update, the National Data Strategy, and the National Artificial Intelligence Strategy. The Health Bill, if passed, as John said, and according to its explanatory notes, will put beyond doubt NHS Digital England's, they're merged now, power to share data in connection with healthcare or adult social care. The amount of data produced within the NHS is huge. A figure I have seen is 1 million uses every 36 hours. It's also going to be detailed at the patient level. For ICS development, NHS England has accredited hundreds of organisations to join the Health System Support Framework, a one-stop shop enabling access to support services from third-party suppliers. In 2021, the HSSF category of population health intelligence listed 45 organisations. 6 were NHS bodies, while the rest were private companies such as Deloitte, Ernst & Young, IBM, Cerner, Atos, McKinsey, Palantir, and PricewaterhouseCoopers. HNS England states that the companies involved will only have access to de-identified or anonymous data, and that is not considered to be sensitive, so not covered by data protection legislation. However, keeping patient data stripped of details such as age, gender, or NHS number becomes difficult when, as in the case of population health management, it's combined with numerous other data sets, and when personalised healthcare and personal health budgets become the norm. Given the nature of IT, with hardware and software updates, new developments, new security risks, and so on, the appointed corporations may well be involved in our health systems in the longer term. Indeed, there are suggestions that our ICSs are to become what are called healthcare learning systems, able to create quality improvement in healthcare year on year. And the learning mentioned includes decision-making algorithmic machine learning continuously fed by the population data along with the outcomes of previous decisions. As an aside, in my experience in the NHS, quality improvement means cuts in costs and services or elements of services, and that will be year on year. For the moment, our personal health data is offered protection by the Data Protection Act and the UK GDPR, which was part of EU law retained in our domestic law following Brexit, but is now open to review. Responding to an invitation by the Prime Minister to look at ways to refresh the UK's approach to regulation, a task force on innovation, growth and regulatory reform calls for a new agile approach to regulation that will allow data to flow more freely and provide a cutting-edge business landscape. This requires reform of legislation and the cutting of red tape, with the introduction of a new proportionality principle that claims to protect citizens' privacy, while the real priority is to boost economic competitiveness. At the same time, the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport described their recent consultation, Data: A New Direction, as the first step in the process for reforming the UK's regime for the protection of personal data. Far from improving data protection, it proposes to muzzle the watchdog for data privacy, the Information Commissioner's Office, reduce safeguards, and increase access to personal health data by third parties, whether government departments, public bodies, or the private sector. The white paper from this consultation is expected out soon, and data campaigning organisations are already preparing for the fight against it ever becoming law, if it contains the government plans as suggested. Third-party use of NHS data is not new. A Financial Times analysis of the NHS Data Release Register shows that over a 5-year period, sensitive patient data was shared not just with public bodies, but also with 43 commercial organisations such as McKinsey, Experian, and KPMG. The health data company i5 received 135 data releases between April and October 2019. What's more, the FT found that there was little control of what happened to data once it left NHS servers. NHS England promised the public that in the drive to digitalise the NHS, patients' privacy and control of their personal data would be a key priority. This assurance has proved to date to be pretty worthless. Comprehensive personal health data has been extracted, stored, and in some cases sold. FT researchers also found that the NHS even passed on 84% of patient data to external organisations where patients had opted out. And this was pseudonymized data, that is, with a weaker protection for data than anonymization. Commercial access to confidential patient data intensified during the COVID pandemic under emergency powers, raising concerns that this precedent will also be used to justify a more permanent and extensive exchange of health data between the NHS and the private sector. In conclusion, reading all the consultations, strategies, and government ambitions suggests that the government wants us to give our personal health data to their corporate partners, as if these are the only ones with the ability to create a productive database, which, with the algorithm technologies, could deliver many positive healthcare benefits. I believe that many people feel that our world-class public universities will and should use our data for research, as should our world-class public NHS for service development. However, as was seen during the beginnings of the COVID pandemic, this government wishes to pursue private rather than public enterprise, with the primary drivers for sharing NHS data being largely economic and geopolitical. I've finished. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Martin, for that introduction to the whole issue. And I'd like to invite Rosa now to be our guest speaker for the rest of this meeting before we have questions. Thanks, Rosa.
Thank you, and thank you, Martin. That was a really interesting introduction, and actually had a lot of detail, so far more than just an introduction. So thank you very much for that. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing at Foxglove about NHS data. And I wanted to start with, which is just kind of slightly riffing off what Martin had said about some statistics about NHS data. And I wanted to give you what is the estimated value of NHS data, which is about 10 billion a year. Because the NHS holds the largest set of machine readable health data on the planet, as far as I understand. And I'm glad to see that Martin is shaking his head and agreeing, which is good. And I think what that means, and what we need to realise when we're thinking about NHS data in general, is that this is data that is being eyed up by all tech giants across the world, across the planet, across the world. And one of the kind of issues that we've been reflecting on is whether the pandemic has changed people's views on health data, to which I would say I'm definitely not convinced it has. I think it has, however, changed the government and industry's hope for what they can achieve with health data. But I think actually the public trust and the public comfort about the use of NHS health data remains very sceptical. And I think it remains sceptical because there's been a failure to build trust. And actually, I think in relation to the issue that we're talking about this evening, actually trust is the key issue, and it goes to the heart of the discussion that we're having and the issues that we're thinking through this evening. Why do I say that trust matters so much? Maybe I'll give you an example from the area in which I live, which is South London. Lambeth and Brixton had one of the lowest rates of vaccine uptake in relation to COVID in England. And I think there's a kind of obviously a kind of complex reason for why that is, but I think one of the key reasons is a lack of trust in the medical authorities, which is to do with issues to do with structural racism, And what we had there was a very kind of cutting edge science being used to come up with a vaccine, and actually a significant number of people in at-risk groups kind of opting out and refusing to have it. And they're doing that, I think, for reasons relating to trust. So I think the key question for us in relation to health data is, how does the NHS better use health data? Because many kind of researchers and practitioners within the NHS tell us that they think that NHS health data could be used better, and it could be used better for the public good and for the public service of the NHS. But how does that happen without sacrificing trust? And the stakes are obviously incredibly high. The rewards of proper data use can be potentially life-saving, but the risks can be kind of minor embarrassment to, in essence, a total corruption of trust in the medical profession, which obviously then leads to worsened kind of patient outcomes. And also, where patients don't trust their practitioners, there's obviously a reluctance to give them what can be very critical information. So for me, when the NHS is talking about how to manage data, trust is not a side issue. It is the absolutely key issue that needs to be considered. And I've been asked to talk about two cases in which I and Foxglove have been involved, where, to be frank, the government failed to build any serious trust, and we tried to challenge what they were doing on legal bases that were to do with consent and consultation and proper data protection impact assessments, but actually kind of stripping out the legal jargon. I think in some ways what these cases came down to was the fact that the government hadn't been open and honest about what they were doing and hadn't built a public trust in what they were trying to do. And it was really on that basis that we challenged them. So the first case I was being asked to talk about is the COVID-19 data store, which, as John mentioned, I talked a little bit about to the COVID-19 inquiry that KONP was so brilliantly involved with. And I'll just skip through a little bit for those who weren't present then, what this data store was and what the legal challenge that we took about it. The data store, and also we learned something last week, which is suggestive of something which I think is very concerning. We all need to look at a little bit further. So the COVID-19 data store was announced way back in March 2020. And the NHS basically said to the public that several US tech giants, so it was Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Faculty, and Palantir, had been brought into the NHS to create a COVID-19 data store, which was going to be the single source of truth about the pandemic. That's the way it was described. And what the COVID-19 data store was it was the first time health and social care data from a variety of different sources was going to be collated on a national kind of scale and held in one place. You know, Whitehall sources described it themselves as unprecedented. Despite it being unprecedented, there was absolutely no serious details about these deals that had been reached with private corporations. And there was no serious information about the types of data that was going to be stored in the data store. So a real lack of transparency. That was made even worse by the fact that the NHS had chosen companies that exist to aggregate and monetize data, in essence. And certainly our view was that these companies chosen definitely had business ambitions to kind of bed down with the NHS long term. So we thought these deals raised serious questions that had to be answered. And before the kind of, and as a result, the deals should be made public so there could be a public debate about them. Some of the questions that we thought arose was, one, had the companies chosen actually earned public trust that was necessary to have access to all of our most sensitive and confidential information? Did they have any track record with the NHS? Was it right and was it safe for all of our most sensitive data to be collated on such a mass scale and held in one place? And what kind of security was in place to protect it, and who would have access to it? So we started with a series of FOIA requests, all of which were unsuccessful. And so we ended up with Open Democracy issuing, basically preparing to issue proceedings and to ask the court to provide an order requiring the deals to be published. In fact, what happened was that the NHS bodies conceded a few days before we were due to file the claim. So after about 3 months of pressure and legal threats, the contracts were finally published. Having looked at the content of the deals, we then, to be honest, started to think there had to be a second legal challenge, because the contracts themselves did not appear to be temporary. And we learned, again, only through a series of letters and kind of threats of legal kind of steps being taken, that 2 further contracts had been signed with Palantir in relation to the data store. And just to kind of have a word on Palantir, you're probably aware of them, but Palantir is a company that was founded by a far-right figure, a major Donald Trump donor, who's called Peter Thiel. It had absolutely no standing in health when it sought the COVID contract work. Its original customers and funding were the CIA. It then expanded into police and border forces, and it helped, and I think it still does, US border forces to deport people from the Mexican-US border. So this is not a company that I would say is instinctively a comfortable partner to enter into our National Health Service, and particularly when you're thinking about issues to do with trust and some of the communities that the NHS is seeking to serve, and some of the at-risk communities who were not, had hesitancy in terms of vaccinations. This is a company that we had real concerns about in terms of their appropriateness as a partner with the NHS to control, as I said, our most sensitive and confidential information. So the second challenge we took was basically to say that if a longer term contract was going to be entered into, i.e. we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, we didn't have an emergency, kind of no procurement, kind of all those temporary rules actually shouldn't be kind of swept aside. We're now back in more normal times, although normality never quite seems as calm as we hope. We argued that actually there needed to be a proper public consultation process and a proper kind of consideration of whether this company should remain the company who is in charge of a data store long term. And a bit like with the first case, we again wrote and basically said that we were concerned that no data protection impact assessment had taken place. And part of the data protection impact assessment was actually to ask people who have data rights, i.e. patients, whether they felt happy with this company remaining in place and whether they felt happy with their data being kind of processed and controlled in the way that the data store was doing so. And I'm pleased to say that again, what happened is that the defendant basically conceded, and so we ended up not having to go to court. So in some ways, we had successful cases, but they were cases obviously we would have preferred not to have to have taken at all. But we were grateful that the NHS kind of took the approach that they did and decided not to go to a full contested hearing in both the cases. But the lessons that we hoped they'd learned didn't seem to really have hit home, because the second case I want to talk to you about is one to do with, that John mentioned at the beginning, to do with the NHS data grab. So in May 2021, the NHS introduced this nationwide mass daily collection process of patient data for adults and children across England. And what this programme, which is called a GPDPR, I mean, can you think of a less interesting acronym or name of a project? But anyway, the GPDPR, or the GP Data Grab, as we decided to call it, basically envisaged that data would be taken daily from all patients in the scope of the project, and could be used and reused for multiple purposes, not simply by the NHS and other health authorities, but also by an array of other bodies in the public health field. And of course, that included commercial entities. So this was 55 million people's data. Medical data from kind of cradle to grave were to be pooled into one central database, supposedly de-identified. The deadline for opt-out was incredibly short. So basically, patients were given less than 6 weeks to discover the existence of this new GPDPR service, understand how it works with minimal information being provided, understand its implications, and then decide whether to opt out. If they didn't manage to do all that within the timescale, then the data was going to be collected and people would only have the right to opt out prospectively. GPs' practices had a single week to implement any opt-outs that they received. And remember, this is at a time when COVID was still very much, at the forefront of most GP practices, and GP practices were being very much relied on. And so again, we, along with a kind of wonderful kind of group of various different interests, took the very clear view that this was unlawful. And data from a legal perspective is a very special category sort of data. And the processing of it is prohibited unless there's very narrowly tailored conditions are complied with. And we said that the GPDPR was unlawful, and it was unlawful because no one's consent had been provided. The notification for opt-out was woefully inadequate. People hadn't been properly consulted about the proposal. And again, there'd been a complete failure to undertake any proper analysis of whether this was a necessary and proportionate act in the interests of public health, given all of the risks that it involved. And therefore, we said that the direction that the Secretary of State had made was unlawful. We sent letter before claims, setting out all those grounds. We received at Foxglove, we were quite kind of flooded with various people's concerns about the service and the project. One of them was obviously about privacy. People were very worried about patient trust being eroded, and that the conversations people were having with their GPs would no longer be private. And of course, in some ways, the de-identification can help with that, but to be frank, it doesn't solve it. They also worried, of course, about NHS data being mixed up with commercial aims. We, as Marta was saying, that continues to be a real concern. And then finally, I think people felt like this decision had been pushed through without any ability to have a say. And it was very unclear really what the purpose or use that the government departments were going to make of it. And so in practice, what happened, because of the kind of publicity that so many campaign groups managed to do about the service and the way that the government had failed, so lots of campaign groups managed to tell people what was being proposed. And I think also as a result, a little bit of the kind of publicity that the legal challenge got, what this meant is about 1 million further people opted out. Actually, I think it may be even slightly higher, but there was a huge doubling basically of the opt-outs. And having built this kind of coalition of doctors, pensioners, a Conservative MP, and some others, the government, in essence, conceded the judicial review claim. And in response to our letter, they wrote and said that the proposal was going to be withdrawn and reconsidered. So it's not off the cards. It's not off the table, and our understanding is it is still being reconsidered, and there is a commitment to a full redesign, and we don't really know much more than that at the moment. But I think what the millions of opt-outs show is that actually there is a real concern about data being shared and pooled for any reasons other than direct care of the millions of kind of fellow citizens that we all live with. And that is something the government absolutely must hear and listen to. And sadly, I don't think it's a message that is yet hitting home. And it seems that we have to be able to kind of mount a legal case for them to kind of stop and reconsider. And I say that in part because, as I mentioned right at the beginning, we learned last week that it looks like, and we're kind of trying to do some further research, but it looks like some of the public health directions that were put in place for COVID only, that was, as I described with the data store, meant that data was being pooled and centralized, that in fact that direction is now going to be extended indefinitely. There was a specific timeline, there's a specific deadline previously, and that seems to now be the proposal is for it to be extended. And that really is of concern, because these temporary measures meant to deal with an emergency pandemic should not become the norm. And I think I would just end with a kind of general view that is that if there is going to be a mass change in the way health data is being handled in this country, our view certainly at Foxglove is that has to be subject to a serious national debate. And that's because trust and basic democratic fairness are crucial to be able to ensure that NHS data kind of is used better, but is used better in a way that is for the public good and the public have trust in it.
Thank you very much, Rosa, for a very informative talk that raises quite a lot of difficult issues, as does Martin. So we're going to move to questions now, which I hope both speakers will consider, and some have been posted in the chat. So the first one says, why did campaign groups allow this to happen? I suppose I'd rephrase that and said, was there a way that campaign groups could have stopped this happening? And of course, we've heard how Foxglove has approached it through a legal route, but you know, what was the writing on the wall? Did we miss it? Could more have been done, I guess, is behind that question. It's quite surprising, Martin, to hear how many times unprotected data has gone to private companies, for example. And is that just accepted as this is, you know, these things happen, or is there any comeback on that? So, but Martin, first, if you'd like to comment.
Yeah, I think a lot of these things happen and we just don't know about it. You know, it was a Financial Times piece of research that uncovered a lot of this. And before then, most people weren't even aware, but obviously some people within the NHS executive were aware, but it was kept secret. And, you know, campaigners do try and contact NHS England regional, and you can't actually get much in the way of response from them. And, you know, if you try with the FOIs against trusts or against the NHS, if anything commercial comes up, you know, you go to tribunal and you're told that this is not to be released. It's very, very difficult sometimes to get things like contract information, well, as campaign groups, from the NHS about what's going on. So I do think that where they know, campaigners have made efforts, definitely, but it's very difficult to stop it.
Okay, so a lot of it goes on under the radar.
Yes,
and in fact, I mean, Rosa dealt with the data grab and the fact that mobilization by a number of campaigning groups did result in a lot of people opting out. Is there anything more you'd like to say to that question, Rosa? Could more have been done? Should we be more alert?
It's a really good question. It's a huge question. I think one of the things that is so tricky, and Martin just touched on it too, I think for people to be able to act, they really need to know what's going on. And one of the problems is there really is a lack of transparency, particularly about, I mean, I think data in general, algorithms in general, I think there is a lack of transparency actually at the moment. And there needs to be, and it's partly because, to be honest, my private view is that the Freedom of Information Act is not a mechanism that is sadly as effective as it should be, because it takes so long for anything to come out, and because of some of the exemptions to do with, which are relied on in relation to kind of commercial interests, and therefore, you know, you end up having to try and appeal it, and it takes some time. But I think, I mean, I think that there is a increased awareness about health data. So when Foxglove we formed Foxglove a couple of years ago, and I think during the course of the time of the organisation, certainly health data has become much more of an issue that's on the agenda, and people are talking about it. And it does feel like data really is, I mean, sadly, despite the kind of brilliant efforts of KONP and others, you know, we've seen an increased kind of bringing in of private corporations and companies into our NHS, and I think data is one of the areas which hasn't yet been kind of completely privatized. And I think we really are at the cusp at this moment of how NHS health data, whether the private corporations are allowed access to it, and if they are, on what basis, because that really is crucial to maintaining it in terms of a kind of public good and a key aspect of the NHS as a public service. And I think we all have to hold on to it and fight for it as long as we possibly can. But it does feel like a crucial moment for me in terms of health data.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Rosa. Now, you also mentioned that trust is absolutely a central issue at the heart of all these discussions about data, who has access and how it's used. And there's another question here about doctor-patient confidentiality, which generally has been a really important principle. And you can trust that if you say something to a doctor, it's not going to be shared except in very unusual circumstances. So what's going to happen to that? You've already said trust is going to be seriously undermined, but you know, most doctors would still expect that what they heard from patients was confidential. Do you think the medical profession is getting exercised about data?
It's a very good question. I think the whole health service, this is from a non-practicing, non-expert health person, a kind of a legal person, but it feels to me like the entire health service really, its foundation is that relationship between patient and clinician, and the trust and confidentiality, which is absolutely a key part of it. One of the ways that some people argue that the kind of data issue can be solved in terms of this question about confidence and this question about confidentiality is that if you de-identify the data, somehow that means the concerns go away. I would quite like to query that, to be honest. I mean, if I give you an example, which actually isn't NHS, but it's about vulnerable people sharing sensitive data. There was a recent news story about a crisis hotline that was called Shout. I don't know if anyone else saw that, but basically Shout was a hotline that suicidal teens and other people who were suffering from depression called if they were feeling desperate and alone. And what the website said is that people's conversations would never, and the word never was used, be shared. But there was a story in the Observer that said that the website had quietly changed and that people's full conversations, again de-identified, were being shared with researchers to run AI on to analyze these conversations. And when the people who were using the service were asked what they thought, I thought it was incredibly actually telling. So just to quote from one of these people from the newspaper report, she said, "My understanding was that the conversation would stay between me and the person I was messaging and wouldn't go any further. If I had known that it would, then I can't say for certain that I would still have used the service." And that is a service which, despite the anonymization, the use here went well beyond people's expectations. And as a result of that, their trust had been violated. In fact, the Shout's US partner crisis helpline went even further. They passed de-identified individual conversations of suicidal people to their kind of for-profit arm, which was training AI to run customer service chatbots. And all of the data we're talking about was de-identified, but actually, is that a safe project? And I think the users there made clear to us that they didn't think it was. And so you really need to have, in order to maintain that trust, I think, absolutely ironclad protections against kind of other uses being creeping in. There has to be a really super clear explanation of when and on what terms any corporation might be let into these data sets. And you really can't skip in any way a kind of democratic engagement on those questions.
Thank you. Martin, do you want to come in at all on?
No, I agree. The shout example was terrible, really terrible. And within psychiatry, confidentiality has been, perhaps more so than elsewhere in medicine, has been incredibly important. But if they are going to produce artificial intelligence in psychiatry, it will have to include the spoken word, because that's all we do. We don't have biological markers or x-rays or anything else. We have what the person says, their mental state, their history. So I think psychiatry represents a particularly difficult area for the future of digitalization and this plan to develop algorithms to predict things.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with questions that are mainly about data. So there's a question from Brian Fisher. I don't know if you can actually see it. You probably can do, but it's commenting on the GP data swipe and saying, obviously that data could be used in a very constructive, positive way to improve healthcare. So what safeguards need to be in place so that can be done safely and in a trustworthy way? Is there an issue about access to data? GP data is held by private companies. I think because GPs are essentially in the private sector in some senses, being self-employed. Is it possible to amend the law to prevent NHS data being shared with private companies for further analysis and use, given that the GPs are already in some senses outside the NHS and private companies? So there's two questions there. I suppose the first one is how can data be used in a way that we wanted it used to benefit patients? What are the safeguards that need to be in place?
Yeah, shall I go first, Martin?
Yeah.
So I think I think this really does go to the kind of heart of the issue, doesn't it? I suspect most people at this meeting would want NHS health data to be used in a way that is beneficial to the NHS and the healthcare that it provides on the terms that it provides to us all as a public service, and that the health data should be part of the public good, in essence, that it's a kind of public asset. And I think, as I said, some of the clinicians and researchers that we've spoken to do feel that data could be used better. But exactly as Brian suggests, the question is on what basis that happens. And I think there has to be absolute clarity about the basis on which that data is pooled, who has access to it, and also on what basis they have access to it. And I think at the moment, what it feels like is happening is the government is trying to bring things in kind of bring it in under the carpet. That's the wrong phrase. I always get these phrases wrong, but kind of bring it in with that in a way which is not fully transparent and fully open. And what that means is we now don't trust them in terms of what they're trying to do with our data. But there are clearly, there could be safeguards in place in relation to the question of access. So one of the key questions that we were asking as part of the GP data grab was this question of who has access to it and on what basis. And to be frank, no answers were really provided. There was no clarity on it. At the moment, there is something called trusted research environments. that are used, but there are even questions there, I think, about who has access to them and on what basis. So these are all really, really big issues that, to be frank, the government hasn't, in my view, hasn't really grappled with, and we've certainly not been asked for our views on it. And as I believe that in order for the health data to be used in a way that is truly effective for the NHS, those protections need to be spelt out incredibly clearly and, to be frank, kept to, because otherwise people are not going to consent to their data being pooled and processed in the way that lots of the kind of suggestions of what's come out post-pandemic that the government wish to do.
Okay, thank you. Martin, anything to add?
I think Brian put another, and he says it's the programs designed and held by private companies that are actually taking the data and using it at the general practice level. And this is the referral program, I believe. And if these companies are taking data and using it to make profits without consent, then of course they shouldn't. And there should be a law that stops them doing that. There should be limits to how they use their data. The contract should be that you use the data just to help make the referrals and not have secondary uses for it, particularly not if they are to, perhaps not what people want done with it, i.e. to be used as a private company. As far as GPs being private practitioners because they're independently contracted, but again, there's huge differences between that and a large corporation that's working in general practice, which does have links to a corporation in America with analytic and AI development capabilities, and data could be moved. I believe data has been moved abroad to be used. Talking about Centene.
Yes, sorry, I confused things a bit by misunderstanding Brian's question. And his point was that it's the private health care companies who collect the data, GPs. Now, there's another question actually from Greg Dropkin, which is whether either of you have a feel for the Labour Party's attitude to the transformation of the NHS into a digital and data-driven system.
Shall I go first on
Martin?
That? Yes. Thank you, Greg. I believe that the new Health Secretary was Vice Chair to the APPG, looking at the fourth industrial revolution, and is extremely keen on the use of data and digitization within the health service. He sees this as the way forward. And I suspect that he would support government agendas to get this off the ground. And looking at the government at the moment, the only way they seem to be trying to get this off the ground is to change legislation. And I suspect that that change in legislation may be supported by, another party that wishes to see these technological advances happen. But there's also rumors, I don't know, Rosa, whether you've heard them, that with the GDPR, because it came from Europe and is one of those Brexit laws that's been moved into domestic law, there's rumors that the government might be looking to try to change it using secondary legislation rather than even considering it in Parliament. And, if they are going to change it in the way that the Data and New Direction says, then they will have no problem because they won't need to get consent, because they'll have changed the definition of what's scientific research, which can include private company research and so on, and what's for the public good as well. So that they really are looking at ways getting around this. It's very interesting. I looked at a KPMG 2018 advice to government, and KPMG in 2018 said exactly what you said, that trust, public trust is what you have to gain. And they even gave the government ways to try and get that trust. And I think this must be the first time they've not done what KPMG perhaps suggested. And perhaps the only way is for them to change the law to do it.
Okay. Any comment, Rosa?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Martin's concerns. I mean, I think there have been rumours, exactly as suggested, that some of the UK GDPR now is, they are looking to water it down. And indeed, we know that kind of one of the bases upon which they were arguing for Brexit was the idea that they'd be able other options in the law, I would argue. So in the GPDPR case, I still can't say that acronym, even though I've said it probably 7,000 times by now, that there are other legal grounds that we were able to argue it, even in the worst case scenario, which are to do with the Human Rights Act, which of course is also under threat by this government, but also under some of the kind of UK common law principles about consent and medical kind of confidential information. So I think that as from a legal practitioner's point of view, there are some other laws that would allow me to make very similar arguments. But having said that, clearly the UK GDPR should not be watered down at all. And actually, at a moment when data is increasingly being used by government and when algorithms are increasingly being used by government, if anything, all of these protections should be enhanced and increased and not watered down. Again, particularly given, as I keep on rabbiting on about, the question of trust is so important in these circumstances.
Okay, thank you for that. Now we've actually reached the time when the meeting should end, but there's one last question which I think is interesting, which is about where the buck stops. Do the medical indemnity companies have views about increasing use of data, machine learning, decisions by computer and algorithm? Something goes wrong, who carries the can for that? And does the Medical Defence Society or the Medical Protection Union have any stance on this that you know of?
So I'm definitely not a medical negligence lawyer, so this is definitely not from a position of expertise at all. But I do know from some kind of colleagues and lawyers who do specialise in this area that this is definitely something they're expecting to be heavily litigated over the next few years. So my takeaway from those comments is it's slightly unclear at the moment. But that is really from a position of non-expertise, so apologies for that.
Yeah.
Understood. Thank you. Martin.
Yeah, I thought that government was hoping that if everything was decided by computers, that the doctors wouldn't be put into difficult situations where they have to make such difficult decisions. But they still have to decide what accountability artificial intelligence will have. Is it the commercial producer that can then be litigated if the decision is harmful, which would be an interesting, would that then stop them wanting to enter the market because they might get litigated if if the law goes that way?
Interesting question. There's also the issue in the bill about deregulation of professions, isn't there? Which is sort of implies that if everything is decided by a computer, then the profession doesn't need to be regulated.
Protection. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to wind up what's been a very interesting meeting, and I'd like to thank Martin and Rosa in particular, obviously, as the two speakers for covering such a lot of important ground. And the KONP working group has already been very active, the data working group, and has produced some very useful papers which are on the website. And there's a new comment on the health and care bill and implications for data management, which I think might be on the website, but the website's been down today, so it might not be until tomorrow. But once again, thank you to the speakers, and thank you to all the participants and the people who've asked questions.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're very welcome. We'll have you again, I'm sure, I hope.
I hope so
Okay.
too.
I'll end the meeting at this point. Thank you.
Bye.